Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th of the Talks program, which totals a series of 25 in all. There's always space, so please take a quick look at the agenda and come back. I can assure you it's worth it. This particular talk gives me particular pleasure, as I've had the satisfaction of working with both Thomas and with Tobia. And I have a huge respect for what they both accomplished in their respective domains. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of each of our guests. Thomas Struth studied at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf in the 70s as a part of the first generation of artists to study photography with Bernd and Hilla Becker. He was awarded a scholarship by the Academy to spend a year in New York, where he produced sober black and white urban landscapes from a central perspective. Throughout his career, he has added images from all over the world to the series. His first comprehensive body of work on streets and architecture, Unconscious Places, has engaged him for 4 decades. Using the same large format camera he employed for the cityscapes, he began a series of color and black and white portraits of individuals and family groups in the mid-1980s, and illustrating Struth's belief in photography as, quote, a tool of scientific origin for psychological exploration. This ongoing work examines the personal and cultural dynamics that condition our self-image, exploring how they will influence our individual and collective identities. In what might be his best-known work, Museum Photographs, 1989 to 2005, he captured anonymous individuals and crowds looking, or not looking, at iconic works of art in the world's museums. These images characterize museum visits as complex social rituals of seeing and being seen, or maybe not being seen, or maybe not seeing, and address the issue of the way art can be experienced in public displays and collectively. In recent years, he has become increasingly interested in the topic of technological innovation and the constructed landscape. I could go on here, but I'd rather it was Thomas telling you in his own words what he's up to. Tobia Bezzola has had an impressive career as a curator, a multifaceted curator, I should add, and as a museum director. After many years as curator of the Kunsthaus Zurich, he went on to direct the Folkwang Museum in Essen, which houses, among other art forms, a hugely important photography collection, and which continues to produce brilliant shows. Tobia is now director of MASI, the Museo d'Arte della Svizzera italiana, in Lugano, Switzerland. He's just started there, but he's already drawn renewed attention to the museum, so as they say, watch that space carefully. Tobia has curated the work of Thomas Struth and knows him well, so let's sit back and hear their thoughts on Thomas's work, but perhaps also on photography itself and where they think it's heading. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks to Bill, thanks to Michael, Fariba, to Tatiana, everybody who helped having us here. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Last year we were with Thomas Demand, so to be a bit an entirely different type of work, of photography, but you're good friends. Maybe we'll start with this kind of odd start. What's the main difference between you and the other Thomas Demand, who was here last year? You know Thomas Demand's work. He builds these sculptures and photographs them and creates his own reality through photography. So you, on the other hand, you've always your work is always related to an exterior reality, to a social reality, a natural reality, a cultural reality. You have never been, actually though you started as an artist, Thomas was a student with Gerhard Richter initially at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf, and only later he changed to Bernd and Hilla Becker's photography class. So maybe is that the moment, the switch in a way, where you chose to keep track of the world instead of building your own world? Is this?
Well,
a valid approach.
Yes, two different questions. Thomas Themann, Thomas's work and my work are very different, of course, and it's, you could say, when you look at his work, you could say he photographs cardboard. I mean, that's just the basic fact. But of course, so the narrative behind the picture is always related to certain strategies of your epic narrative that has to do with the conditions of our life, and so in a way, and the reasons for which the artist or the person who makes the work and I think that in different ways it requires a work of deciphering on the part of the spectator to decipher the reasons that both of us or any artist has to make the work that they're doing. Beyond what you see. I mean, with Thomas's work, you see cardboard surfaces, and you see a picture that existed already, that he reconstructs. And with my work, you see you see your particular things, or your particular vistas that are collected to speak about certain issues that I find important, that were deeply important to me as a person, as a private person, and that I thought are very important to share with other people. That's a kind of strange space-like.
Starting here with the streets, architecture has always been very, very important to you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that came from growing up in post-war Germany, where people like me were confronted with kind of the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, and where it was mostly visible was in the architecture. I did a little book that some of you might know 2 years ago called Walking, that has all these small architecture details. And when I was working on the book, I thought it would be absolutely necessary to photograph the entrance of the building in Düsseldorf where we lived when I was a child, because it was an old building where the facade had been so ruined by shrapnel during the war that it had to be plastered over. So it was actually, inside it was a pre-war building, but from the outside it looked like a 60s building, like a white cement facade with black stone around the windows. And right next to it was a pre-war building that was unharmed. And there was only one thing that, of countless ruptures in architecture where I felt that beyond all the stories that my parents' generation or people tell you in the architecture that exists and that you live in, you can read a particular truth that's undeniable.
So what we're doing now is we're kind of going through a bit quickly Thomas's career, if it works, yeah, chronologically.
I inserted a few examples of these pictures of buildings, single buildings, which fascinated me because I've always been, sort of fascinated by ugly buildings, ugly apartment buildings, because you're so omnipresent everywhere. You're from St. Petersburg to Taipei, from Sydney to Winterthur or Geneva. That's in Geneva, you find them everywhere. And I always felt they don't have a voice, and I thought it would be interesting to photograph them in a very beautiful manner, and just you show their personality and show their kind of your rigidity, and there's the element of science fiction in them, and so forth. In a way, they were, one actor or actress versus many, a big stage set that was the street. During the early years, in the beginning when I did this with a 35mm, I was still studying painting actually with Gerd Richter, and I knew zero about photography history. I was merely following a particular concept, and I photographed streets with 35mm in a central perspective because I like the idea of comparison, which I think is very important in general for any artistic creation. If you have, for example, if you take Monet's water lily paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago, they have a beautiful wall where you see 4 of those paintings next to each other, and it's a fabulous opportunity to evaluate every single one of them amongst the 4 that are fairly similar. But what I want to say is that then when I was introduced by Bernard Tiller to the large camera format, and I photographed 300 streets in Düsseldorf, then I came to London with Axel Hütte. The first photograph you saw there, I made in London in 1977. And then I started to realize some pictures are better than others. So my editing method, you rapidly became more radical. For example, the 300 pictures I took in Düsseldorf with 5x7-inch camera, I think 2 or 3 survived my later editing, and I think that's very important, and that's a big weakness. I'm sorry to say that with many photographers or artists who work with photography in a similar manner, that they're just too much in love with what they do, and they're not serious enough to reject 98% of what they did because they think, oh, I did it, so it must be good. And I don't believe in that. Of course, through the years, my pre-editing became much tougher, so I don't photograph so often anymore. I photograph maybe like 5 or 6 times a year. Now.
Do you take snapshots?
Yeah,
Every day
I do.
For private life, you do that?
Yeah, I do. I mean,
but,
you can, you just replace Polaroid, even though I rarely, I think I worked with Polaroid maybe twice in my life to find out, because I never work with flash, or almost never, which began with the fact that I didn't have the money to work with flash, and then also when you work with flash, you can't really see what's going on unless you make a Polaroid or you test it, and it's somehow, I always work with available light, with maybe 2 exceptions where I used flash just because it was necessary.
You are one of the foremost of probably the first generation of post-war artists who started out being photographers, but deliberately and exclusively working for the art world. Was it ever any thought you had to become a commercial photographer? Was that a possibility when you were 28 years old?
No.
Never?
No.
And
no, I mean,
was it the Bechers, or what was it that gave you the courage or to believe that it might be possible to have a career working with photography, but outside of the commercial photography world, not doing any advertising, fashion, news, or whatever?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. What can I say? So I was born in '54, which means I was a little bit too young to be like an active political person in the '60s. So, but I was old enough to be a happy witness and a very excited partaker of the pop music world at the time, I always played music myself for many years when I was younger, and I still play the drums a little bit. And it just happened that art and music seemed to be the only thing that I was interested in, and that I had a certain talent in a way, and a lot of patience. Normally I'm a rather impatient person, but when it comes to working, I'm very patient and I'm very persistent. So I don't mind to spend, I often used to work in the dark room until the morning, and then had breakfast and went to bed. Yeah, so in a way, and also I maybe as a reaction in a response to the feeling that my parent generation, like my father was a soldier in Hitler's army because he was young and he couldn't. So this idea of having to do something that somebody else tells you was not very appealing to me. So I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And when I finished the academy, I had to do civil service, and then I had to make a living. I didn't sell anything yet, so I've photographed sculpture for sculptors in Düsseldorf, and I did some odd jobs. I worked for the Post, which means I had a job. They hired me to photograph newly renovated post offices, like for 3 or 4 years, and so I made, they called me and said, we have this new post office in Mülheim-Ruhr or in Dortmund or so, and so I went there to photograph. I hated it, but and I always did 5x7 color negatives and so on and so forth. And when I showed it to them, then I disliked the moment that they would say, this is good, this is not so good. I thought, it's just I do it as long as it's necessary. But
we're entering here with the images a second of the series of works. Your work, which is crucial, develops in series. So you're not one who goes out in the morning with his camera and takes single shots of events or random situation that you might encounter in your life, but you have, and that's actually the question, was it a deliberate choice in the very beginning that you would do your photographic work would only develop in series, or did that just somehow happen?
That's a normal, I mean, first of all, I don't like the word series. I always find that immediately it rings the tone that only the whole thing matters and every single picture doesn't matter so much within the so-called series. So I'm not such a fan of that. I think that came simply out of the fact that when you work on something, like you work on something to find out what you're doing, for yourself. Like Rembrandt painted a series of self-portraits, or Kandinsky developed a series of abstract paintings. And I'm sure when he started, then he continued on that path to find, to re-examine what his interests are. Mm-hmm. So for me, there was always, let's say, a lot of thought in the beginning. What is it, and what's the opportunity in there? And with opportunity, I mean, what's the epic narrative in a way? And because I was always interested or very aware about the psychological ingredient of existence, of emotions, and the question of how do you explain your feelings, and how do you what are the components that form your identity, and how the relationship between individual and society, and the family group as the primary group. Hello.
Hello. We have a problem. Thank you. You've always chosen very huge and important, but also very, well, not fancy subject matters. So we have streets in the first place, and then where we came to next, families. A family is a basic given of human life. Everybody has a family. Everybody has family life. Was there a context that why you chose to choose families as a subject matter?
Well, there's all a deliberate choice. Yeah, it's maybe you could call it kind of deliberate choice out of political reasons that I thought the ordinary.
Political, would you say?
Well, in a sense that I've never been so. You cannot say never, but in the beginning, particularly, I was not interested in the exotic, special things. But I was always interested in things that I assumed that everyone or most people share in a way. Mm-hmm. So and to disclose or uncover certain things that I thought are not have not been made visible in a certain way. And with family portraits, that had to do in the beginning. The starting point with this was maybe, which at the time when I started this, I hadn't realized this. But when I was a young guy, when I was 12, 13 or so, I looked a lot at a photography album that was a war album that my father had, that was kind of a fake black leather thing with a silver steel helmet embossed, and in that album were photographs that showed my father with other soldiers in France, in Russia during the war, and also in the photo studio when he was on vacation from the front. Very strange. And I was, so I think that was my starting point with photography in a way, where I saw that there's information in photographs that are beyond your oral history in a way that's being told by people, and I've found that, of course, utterly wondersome and intriguing and scary somehow, and strange and very touching in a way. Then many years later, I became friends with a psychoanalyst who was not my psychoanalyst, just a psychoanalyst, and his name was Ingo Hartmann. He passed away in 2003, and he I mean, some people might have read about this because I talked about this before. He worked with new patients. When new patients came, new people came to practice and to ask for help, and they talked about their family history or why they thought that they were having problems, and he asked them, "Can you bring 2 or 3 photographs that represent what your family life was like?" And when we met, and I had the darkroom and the tools and the knowledge to make reproductions, he said, "Would you be willing?" It's like I always thought I'd like to make an exhibition of the photographs I've collected, and I said, "Sure, it sounds interesting." So we looked through these photographs and collected more photographs, and I included some photographs, pictures. I mean, I don't have them here. That I selected thinking about what our family life was like, and I reproduced them, and we worked with them quite a bit and read what stories became visible in these pictures, and then we made two exhibitions, one in Düsseldorf in the Institute where he worked, and one in Freiburg, And a few years later, when I was a guest with a family in Scotland, in Edinburgh, I decided after 3 weeks, what can I give this family? And I thought, oh, I'll make a family portrait. Then 1 year later, I was in Japan for the first time, I made a family portrait, same situation. Then I saw these two pictures, and I felt, oh my God, this is like a kernel element of similar things I was interested in architecture. Here's the society in the larger historical context, and the vibrations and the unconscious element that is we came into effect through people who created that environment. And here's a family where everything starts, and it's just 4 or 5 people, and you just acknowledge this moment in time where they just stand together, and I don't direct them, because from that study with Ingvar Hartmann, I knew that one important thing is to let people do whatever they want. So I just choose the frame and the location, and then I said, you take your space or take your position, and they do. So in a way, and I still do that. I still make
since we're here in London, was the
occasionally.
portrait with Her Majesty, was that the same procedure, or was it any different from the usual family?
Did you show that already?
Yeah.
So, well, that was a strange thing where I just received a phone call by Paul Moorhouse, who was the curator at the National Portrait Gallery at the time, and they wanted to do a commission, a photograph for the 70th anniversary, or I think it was the 60th, 70th, 60th anniversary of the Queen's reign. And I thought, it's unbelievable. This is so strange, because I never photograph famous people. I'm not interested in it. And then I thought, I need 3 days to think about it. And I evaluated what speaks for it and what speaks against it. So, and I said, I cannot say no. But here, I couldn't, of course, you meet them before, so it was, it's a totally different story. And I spent a lot of time analyzing the existing photographs and look at things that I didn't like in all these photographs. And sort of I spent maybe 6 months preparing and depict this encounter. And went with 2 assistants to that room with the sofa and photographed my assistants in that position.
Did you choose the location and the setting, or did they?
Well, one of my conditions was, from studying the other pictures, I said, I made a condition, I said, I need to be able to make 3 or 4 sittings here, because it's like I'm like a painter. I'm not like a painter, but there's no guarantee that it will work in the first sitting. And then secondly, I insisted that I need to choose the dress, because I couldn't risk that I make the environment and then I choose the thing, and then she comes in with a pink dress or so, and and I say, I'm sorry, Your Majesty, can you change? So it was very elaborate preparation, and also I decided, because it's so strange and so difficult, I do it with 8x10, so to make it even more cumbersome or more difficult, and you test it again before we made a test whether when the focus is really on the emulsion of the film sheet, because I wasn't so completely sure, and it was very, I read a biography of Queen Elizabeth, or at least about the first part of her life, which I found very interesting, because everybody in preparation said to me, oh, she has such a sense of duty. And I thought, okay, sense of duty, sure, but where does it come from, in a way? Yeah, because it's not necessarily, it's not for granted, in a way. So I studied that, and then around the time this movie came out, The King's Speech, which I found very helpful. So it was, and when I saw this contact sheet, I thought, bingo. And I showed it recently, last year. I showed it in a big show at Haus der Kunst in Munich, amongst other portraits, in a way. But it has to be, I'm sure some people have seen the original picture, because it's very, I had an article in, I think, Süddeutsche Zeitung or Frankfurter Allgemeine. There's a series of articles that is about failed works by good artists. And there was an article about this picture as a failed artwork, which made me think she hasn't seen the original picture. She saw the image, but not the actual work. Because the picture is very big, and it's extremely sharp, and it's just a totally different encounter with. Like that, it looks pretty conventional, even though when you really look at it, and you allow yourself to feel the psychology of these two people, it's quite interesting. But when you stand in front of the big picture, it's a different story, I find.
Which leads us maybe to the museum pictures, I think, which are about people gazing at pictures, at big pictures in galleries. Was that also a consequence of your own work being shown in exhibitions, in Kunsthalle, art centers, museums by the time, and you experienced how your own work was being viewed by visitors in space?
Yeah, I grew up during high school time. I had the fortune to go to high school nearby Cologne, and one very important thing for me was to be able to go to Museum Ludwig at the time in the 60s, the late 60s and early 70s, and to see have all these works of art from your medieval, your Christian painting to pop art and to modern art, recent contemporary art, and Museum Ludwig was most of the time during these visits really empty. So there were maybe in the entire museum 20 people, which means when I walked around, there was maybe a maximum 2 other people in the room, and most of the time I was alone. So, which meant I could listen with my eyes very, very carefully and feel what, sort of evaluate what things would tell me, and do kind of my own ranking and just be really fascinated and overwhelmed and charged with all these things that I would see. In the late 80s, I more or less started to sell work around 1988, 87, so more or less 7 years after I left the academy, and during that time I also started to show in institutions. Kunsthalle Bern was my first institutional show. Then I showed in Madrid, in Barcelona, and here and there. And I was confronted with questions here. What does it mean when your work lands in a museum? And I looked at it from a different perspective. I thought, is that like a cemetery for art? So where it's exhibited, does it mean the artwork dies in a way, or what can it? You make stay alive. And in the late 80s, like after that decade of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Helmut Kohl in Germany, the political climate had changed completely, and tourism had changed quite a lot. So the museums, particularly something like the Louvre or the Academy Gallery in Venice, were very crowded and became more like a tourist attraction. And I felt that it would be good to make a statement or to remind people that the fame of artworks should not disturb the intellectual or emotional consumption of art as a private person. And that I saw many people come in and they just walk, first work, second work, and they would walk, and sort of, try to understand every piece. And I felt this is not a question of religion. This is not a devotional. They should take works of art, every work of art, as a contemporary work of that time in which it was made. And then I saw this opportunity to create pictorial time tunnels between two artists and their models. So me as a living artist photographing the visitors and the picture together that another artist had made 300 years ago or 500 years ago with his or her models, and to almost make you make an advertising campaign, how to deal with art. And in the beginning, I thought about making it kind of a poster exhibition in the subway in London or Paris or so. But then I tested it in different sizes, and then I started to make big pictures more or less with this work. That was the starting point.
We are now traveling through the world. We see architectures from Latin America, from New York, Asia.
This was another step, more or less, after paying attention to the museum photographs. In the mid-90s, I traveled to China a few times, and I made study trips in China between 95 and 2002, and that was very very interesting and very intense and fascinating. And I dropped the strategy of wanting to achieve empty street photographs, because it would have been ridiculous in China. So I applied my experience that I had made in the museums, waiting for particular formations of visitors to the streets in China. And after that, I wasn't so sure. For 2 or 3 years, I felt maybe that's it. Maybe I have nothing else to say, or I didn't quite know where to put my attention to. So I decided to go back to architecture in a different way, and also in a more generalistic way. For example, the picture of Times Square was a result of many, many years of looking at Times Square, and I was thinking about photography history and feeling I would like to make a picture of Times Square, but I didn't see what that picture would be like until one day in 2000. I don't know, or was it 99? I think in 2000, all of a sudden there was this NASDAQ building where the entire building was a screen, and I thought this is a different era of architecture and urbanism, and I decided to make the picture. So these pictures are all quite big as well. the picture from Lima of Cerro Moro Solar is a kind of almost biblical, archaic image of slums that grow up in the mountain, and it's an example. These pictures are all what are they called? Like your stereotypes or your types of something that exists many times over in different places. But my interest was to make the image of this situation or this epic content. And then these were, again, before I thought the museum work is finished, then I just encountered 3 situations that were where I went back, and they are have 3 different themes. The first one, go back to the Tokyo one. That was before. So this one was about a crazy installation of Delacroix's painting La Liberté sur les barricades, which belongs to the Louvre. It was exhibited in Tokyo in a vitrine heavily guarded, people armed by this guard there, and it was in a setup like a cinema space, and it was culturally one of the craziest installations of work of art that I've ever seen. And I had actually booked, my flight back was that evening, and when I saw this, I called my gallery in Japan. I said, I have to change my flight. You have to call the Louvre to get permission, and so I stayed 3 more days to make this picture. So for me, this is a kind of bizarre encounter of 2 different cultures, and a situation where a painting is presented as a sacred object in a vitrine, but it's also very cinematographic. So it's a very bizarre crossing of different you have different phenomenon that I found very striking. The next one is the self-portrait is me in front of a self-portrait of Dürer, and I felt at the time it was in 2000. There was the Dürer paintings from 1500. My photograph is from 2000. This was 500 years, and it's also like a movie scene in a way. Dürer is just pausing to talk to the public in a way, and I'm looking at Dürer before he looks at me again to talk to me, or I talk to him, and it had a little bit to do with somehow, like I don't want to overstate it, but it had a little bit to do with the fact that at that time I was 46, I was 45, and I felt like, okay, I'm German, what can I do? So it took me a long time to come to peace with it in a way, because I'm not personally responsible, but I felt, it had something to do with accepting this, that you cannot choose where you were born. You're like this, it's like the birth gift, You're a man or a woman. You have the parents you got. You can't do anything about it. You have the time you were born in and the location. That's it. Have a good start. That's interesting. That's something that cannot be overrated in a way. Also for your own life, sort of to acknowledge that and sort of you find peace with it, or
The academia is a bit different because it's an installation. There are not so many pieces that you did that are really installations of several photographs that then create the space. Usually you work with one single image.
That's true. I mean, I'm extremely particular with installation since the very beginning, which came from growing up with minimal and conceptual art, where the relationship between the artwork and the space and the location and the meaning of the place is very, very important.
Crucial.
So that was an inevitable thing for me. But it's true, I never, these pictures came about through a long, lingering desire to, if there's a possibility that I could use my camera, that my camera could turn into a painting or a work of art, and I could look in the face of the audience and see the psychological wondering and drama and pain and joy and whatever artwork creates in the spectator. And I debated it with some people at the Metropolitan Museum to make a fake wall and talk to some lawyers, but that was not the way, until suddenly I was invited to do something in connection with the 500th anniversary of David by Michelangelo, the sculptor. And I first said, I'm not interested in that work of art. And my New York gallerist, Marion Goodman, said, let's go to Florence and look at it. So I said, okay. So we flew to Florence, and all of a sudden I saw the opportunity to put the camera next to the David sculpture and just photograph people. And then when it was also with 8x10, and then when I exhibited them first in New York, I realized on location that I could hang them as a frieze. So I had one room with the frieze you showed before, and there were 4 pictures hung together, and on the other side there were 3, and on the 2 small sides there was 1 picture each. So you were really in that space surrounded by this theater of contemporary travelers. And then I did 2 more similar things, one at St. Petersburg, the Hermitage. These people look at Leonardo painting of mother and child, and in Madrid I decided to work exclusively with Velázquez paintings, because I like Velázquez, who doesn't? And then the Prado invited me to make a presentation, or to help them open the new wing that they built, and I made three installations with these 3 friezes, and they also invited me to put some other work in the collection, which was a bit scary, but it was interesting.
Thomas, we're not even halfway through and we're already getting signs. Maybe we get a chance on your most recent work to talk.
So I did, just briefly, I got interested in science and technology because of the question of what is progress, or like under what category are we thinking about progress, and it was in a way catapulted finally by the failure of this CO2 agreement meeting in Copenhagen, where I thought, no, I want to look at technology, and I want to look at the obsession that we have with the hopes and the expectations we have for our life through technology, and that's been going on for 10 years maybe, which in the end included 3 pictures that had to do with medical procedures, because I thought, where does the machine and the human body, or the human figure, become closest? And I thought, of course, in medicine, and I made 2 pictures at one had a prostate operation.
Do we have them here?
Yeah, I think so. So this was a small detour at Disney, because I thought this was a kind of archaic, the artificial intelligence thing somehow, where was it like something that somebody saw was turned into a fake? Yeah, this is.
Sorry, it's
Yeah.
my mistake. Where was it? Here, yes.
Yeah, the one before is the prostate operation. This one, and that took like 3 operations. You're witnessing or working, photographing at 3 operations, because in the beginning I didn't know somehow I didn't know about the framing. I didn't know really. It needed just one picture, and it needed to be express sort of in a peak manner, sort of the hope or the surrender to the hope of that the machinery and the machine operators will create a survival for the person. And in a way, it's sort of the machine is hovering over the body, and the body is just covered, and you only see the belly. But the problem was, for example, that the position of the tools were very important, and I only realized that when I started to work and I examined the results that I had. Then the next one was a brain, like a tumor removal in a person's head, for which at first you watch an operation like this, which was a very, I don't know if anybody has seen something like that. Is that a surgeon in the audience? No. So it's a very mesmerizing, irritating experience to when you're not a doctor or not a surgeon, and you witness like an open brain surgery. And I first decided I cannot do this. But there was one snapshot that I'd made during that operation, before the operation started, which somehow reminded me of Mantegna's Dead Christ painting that's in Milan, and some of that picture came back in my mind over a year or two, and then I decided I want to give it a try to do something like that, and that was the result. And so I was already in the realm of mortality in a way, and the most recent pictures I'm doing right now are totally different. This is more technology. It's very, very recent. But this was the first picture from a new body of work that I started in November 16, photographing deceased animals in an institute for zoo and wildlife research in Berlin, where I go to photograph animals that have just died, like in the morning or the day before, and it's still sort of in the making. I've exhibited these in New York and Brussels, and you're right now in Berlin and at Max Hetzler Gallery. They're very different in size. This was maybe a Bengal cat baby that was 8 days old. That was that big, and the pictures are only that big. It's very small, and it's still, because I'm in the process. It's a bit difficult for me to speak about this because I follow very closely. How can I say, to examine the necessity for me personally, is that what I'm thinking, is that something I really need to do, I'm really sort of excited about, and I'm not like excited like that, but I feel sort of
Urgency.
yeah, urgency or so, and so. But when I'm in it, it's I can only say a few things in a way. It's important for me that they. It's kind of a statement that partly has to do with my own mortality. I'm turning 64 this year, so friends of mine died, and our parents are both dead, so I'm kind of you're closer to the end of my life. I mean, I'm not, I'm healthy, I'm not sick, but still, it's a different perspective. I feel, I read, which is kind of a self-help strategy with this insanity of Brexit and Trump and Erdogan and all this. I've just felt it would be good to do something about mortality.
Thank you. Maybe that's a good.
First,
let's end it here. Yes.
good luck.
Any questions?
How did you remain anonymous in the museum pictures? I assume you had a large format camera.
Yeah.
And looking at the pictures, it looks like people don't know you're there.
Yeah, that's fairly easy. I think that people always assumed that I'm a staff member, that I'm the museum photographer, which I was, but not that I'm not. I was not hired.
You didn't
Not
have
much.
people posing for hours because they wanted to be in your shot.
No, I was just sort of working there with the camera, and I believe that they made assumptions that I worked for the museum, and that they didn't. I mean, it's actually, there's a funny side of this that finally when I photographed at the Prado, people came up to me and asked, "Are you German?" Yeah, I told my Struth, and I thought, okay, this is it. This is over. I can't do that anymore.
Is it a 5.4 or 10.8?
Huh?
What format camera do you use?
I used with the museum pictures in the beginning. All the first ones between 89 and 91 were all 13 by 18 centimeter. Then I did some 4x5s, and then all the in Florence and the Prado was 8 by 10. And in the Prado I used, it was also a different thing. You being more known and having more opportunities. The director allowed me to put flashlights in the skylights. So I had like 16 flashlights in 3 different spaces and a radio transmitter, so I could get to a 15th of a second. And there was also something inside story that when I started at the Prado, in the first 2 days, I realized I'm trying to imitate myself. I'm trying to make the pictures I did in the late 80s, and I thought this is nonsense. So I decided to go more inside the crowd and put the tripod 8 by 10 on wheels, and I just looked at sceneries, and I drove the camera quickly here, put it down, here in the glass, focus and expose, which is kind of crazy, but that's what I did.
Please.
Can I please ask you, to what extent do you think your work may have been influenced by your early interactions with Gale? Because you mentioned in your commentary that part of what you were doing was sort of revealing things that maybe we haven't noticed, and I sort of feel that Rita's work is all about revealing the hidden. I just wonder whether there's a connection or maybe even sometimes inspiration.
Could be, I don't know. I think I learned more. I mean, I think what I learned from him or what I saw there, particularly because I worked a few times for him, maybe 10 or 15 times, I worked in the studio on little things or so, and it was the first time that I saw a professional artist at work, like who had sort of his own, developed his own strategies, and I mean with strategies not so much like a success strategy, but like a plan, like he worked along a plan that he set up for himself. He had a big studio, and he was unsentimental, you know, actually not more or less an executing administrator of a plan that he had, rather than an artist. I mean, he does not have much of an kitschy artist demeanor, you know, which I found really pleasant and inspiring, and also this thing about self-criticism, you know, which I think is one of the most important things. To be, you know, you're rather merciless to yourself in editing, and just you're saying, okay, I worked 5 years, but I've only one picture or two. Yeah.
There's another question.
When and how do you decide about the size of the final print?
Yeah,
Yes, when and how is the decision taken about the size of the print, the final?
Yeah, nowadays I have a certain idea. You know, for example, that I just have a certain idea what size the picture needs, and when I'm not sure, but when it comes to printing, I use a projector. I just use a scan, like a file of the picture, and project it on my studio wall. Even though it's not the same thing, then I make a print, and then sometimes it's a little too big. So I spend a lot of time working on the size. This decision, particularly since with the technology pictures, for the first time I ever work, and also with the dead animals, that pictures can be that big, or can be like 3.50 meters by 270 or so. So it really it has a lot to do with you're standing in front of the picture in a normal distance that you have as a spectator, and what your own body feels like in size, and it has a lot to do with whether any spatial portion in the picture gets boring. Yeah, so one trick that I showed my students when I was teaching 25 years ago was always, I don't know who showed me that, or whether it was my idea. I'm sure somebody showed me to put the picture upside down, because then you just see it as a graphical weight order in a way. For example, here the animal picture are all digital shots, because with a large format I would take like 10 times as long, and I did many pictures, like, I mean, the zebra stayed like this, lying on the floor, but I did many pictures turning the zebra in the frame a lot, because the problem is when this here, this is a dangerous field to get bored, like to ruin the picture by getting, if that would be like 20 millimeters wider, that would be like a void that would sort of distract from the narrative in a way. So I'm extremely meticulous with the order of everything that's in the frame, because it matters a lot.
Yes.
What important is digital and analog techniques for you? And would you consider, with your technology pictures, being interested in shooting digitally, or is it a romantic notion to be working with analog?
No. That's also the logic of this was that when digital cameras started to appear, I bought a digital camera, a small one, but when you work with 5x7 for 30 years already, the quality is just so bad that you can't use it. Then you get more and more million pixels, and then occasionally I bought another camera, but it did not compare anything with large format. Then finally last year I bought a phase 1 camera with 100 million pixels, because before they had only 30 and they tried to sell me one. I said, this is not enough. And then finally it had 100 million. And now I work with it, but it's also different. It has some advantages, it has a lot of disadvantages in terms of how you maneuver the camera versus 8x10 has a lot of disadvantages. I mean, when I work with 8x10 now, I'm thinking, wow, it's like, it's very difficult to see what's on the screen even, and you're traveling with 8x10. When I went to the Prado 11 years ago, I had my luggage was 16 cases. So, but I'm not against this or that. I mean, I realize now when I did also some of the technology pictures are digital, when I don't need the shifting, when I don't need a huge size, that's totally fine.
Yes, please. The Israel, yeah. Maybe we go back. There's
what do you want to know? Yeah. Yeah, that was I made these pictures in the context of a larger photographic project that came to me by invitation through a French photographer, Frédéric Brenner, who had photographed a lot in the diaspora around the world, in Jewish communities, in very many different places. And when he was finished with this, he had the idea to invite 10 or 12 foreign photographers and raise money to make a project in Israel and Palestine. And I was one of them, and I'd never been to this area, and I decided to participate. And you studied the country. I drove. I was guided by many different guides in different special areas, but more Israeli than Palestinian. But yet I was also in Hebron and in Ramallah several times. So I try to steer my way through what kind of pictures I could make there. And what happened is that on both sides, I was guided by empathy and by kind of sadness somehow, and the complexity of the situation, even though when you come from the outside, you think that the complexity can also be an excuse, for not you acting constructively, because if it's complex and complicated, you always have an excuse of leaving it like it is in a certain way. So there was one project I worked on for 5 years or so, during 8 trips I made there, and the result is 17 pictures that I published with Michael Mack in London. There's a book with these 17 pictures.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time's up. You? Yeah. Thank you so much, Thomas.